The steam from my tea curled slowly, blurring the sharp edge of morning. Across the table, her voice slipped between the clink of cutlery, "This isn't your home." No flare of anger, no raised tone, just a statement dressed in finality. My son kept his head bowed, spreading butter as if he hadn't heard. I didn't answer. I simply folded my hands in my lap and let the silence thicken, knowing the walls around us would not be hers much longer. Before we continue, I'd love to know, where are you watching from today? Comment below. Before she came, mornings in this house felt like the inside of an old quilt, soft, familiar, and stitched with years of use. I would rise before the sun, slip my feet into worn slippers, and step into a kitchen still wrapped in the night's hush. The kettle would hum to life, and as it did, the scent of rising dough from the bread I'd set the evening before would greet me. Those small things, the hiss of water, the warmth of yeast, were the sounds and smells of home. My husband and I built this house together, brick by brick. Not all at once, but over seasons, in between his shifts at the mill and my hours at the dress shop. We carried every stone, planted every shrub, painted every wall with our own hands. Even now, I can still remember the feel of the trowel in my palm, the sharp scent of wet cement, the way he would wipe his brow with the back of his wrist and grin at me, teeth bright against his sun-browned skin. This place was never just wood and nails, it was our proof that hard work could root itself into the earth. Our son was born here, in the very room that would one day be his. I remember the night he came, rain against the roof, my husband's hand gripping mine so tightly I thought we'd both break. That boy grew up running barefoot in the back garden, his knees forever scraped, his pockets full of stones and secrets. Summers were a riot of noise, the clang of the screen door, the sweet slap of watermelon on plates, his laughter carrying all the way to the street. Winters were quieter, the three of us huddled by the fire, the air rich with wood smoke and the smell of stew simmering in the pot. Even after my husband passed, the house still felt alive. My son was nearly grown then, but he stayed with me, helping keep the garden neat and the gutters clear. We didn't talk much about grief, just lived around it, side by side. I made him tea the way his father used to, and he would fix things without being asked. There was a comfort in that quiet understanding. When he met her, I wanted to be glad. I remember the day he brought her through the door for the first time. I had baked honey cake that morning, not for her, but it seemed like a kindness to serve it warm. She was polite, her smile small but deliberate, like something placed carefully on a shelf. Her hair was neat, her dress pressed, her handshake firm but fleeting. She looked around the living room with eyes that measured instead of admired, but I thought little of it then. At first, I believed she would become part of the home the way a new chair or rug does, something that changes the space but blends with time. They would visit on Sundays, sitting at the table my husband had built. She would talk about the places she wanted to travel, the life she imagined. My son's eyes softened when he looked at her, and I took that as reason enough to welcome her without question. The day they announced their engagement, he came alone. He told me over tea, his voice light but careful, like he was waiting for me to disapprove. I didn't. I hugged him, kissed his cheek, and told him I wished them both happiness. Inside, I hoped she would find her own corner of warmth in this house, not to replace what I'd built, but to add to it. When they married, the reception was bright and noisy, all clinking glasses and swirling music. I sat beside the cake table, watching my son laugh more freely than I had seen in years. She flitted among the guests like a bird, her dress catching the light. People admired her, and she seemed to bask in it. I wanted to believe this was a good thing, that the house would be livelier, the table fuller, the rooms warmed by more voices. They moved in a few weeks after the wedding. It was meant to be temporary, while they saved for a place of their own. I cleared a space in the wardrobe for her clothes, bought extra towels, and even shifted my sewing table to make their room more comfortable. She thanked me with a smile that never quite reached her eyes. But I told myself these were just early days, that warmth takes time to grow between people. And for a little while, life seemed good. We shared meals in the evenings, swapping stories about work or neighbors. She sometimes helped me in the kitchen, though she preferred her own recipes, lighter, spicier, more modern. I would nod and taste politely, though I missed the slow stews and roasts I'd cooked for years. My son seemed content, and that was enough for me. The neighbors remarked on how happy we must be, three under one roof. I would smile, nod, and keep my doubts to myself. After all, a home is more than a place to live, it is a rhythm, a shared understanding. And at that time, I still believed we could find one together. If you ask me what I value most, it isn't money or possessions. It's knowing I earned my place in the world. My parents had little, just a patch of land and a small wooden house that creaked with the wind, but they taught me the worth of honest work. My father used to say, if your name is on it, it should stand longer than you do. I carried that into everything I touched. This house was my life's work. My husband and I didn't take out a mortgage, we built it the long way, years of saving coins in a tin box that sat at the back of our pantry. We refused to owe anyone more than gratitude. When the foundation was finally poured, I stood barefoot in the wet soil and felt as if roots had grown from my heels into the earth. That memory alone has kept me standing in moments when I thought I might bend. I passed those lessons to my son, though I never knew how much of them took root. He was a good boy, respectful, quick to help, but like many young people, his eyes were set on horizons beyond what he could touch. I understood. I had been young once, too. Still, I hoped he'd carry that sense of grounding, the knowledge that the walls you live under mean something because you've put yourself into them. When he finished school, the work he found wasn't steady. Some months, he came home with barely enough to cover his own expenses. I never complained, never hinted at disappointment. I cooked extra portions, pressed bills into his palm when I knew his pride would make him refuse if I asked outright. For petrol, I'd say, or, take this for lunch tomorrow. The truth was, I would have gone without so he didn't have to. He never asked for much, but I could see the quiet weight of wanting more than what he could provide for himself. That's why, when he told me he'd met someone special, I let myself believe it was a good thing, that she might bring him the joy and steadiness I could not give. When I met her properly, she was dressed sharply, her posture straight, her handshake quick. She spoke of her work in an office across town, how she had plans for travel, for a home with more space, maybe even a garden if it didn't require too much maintenance. She smiled as she said it, but her gaze didn't soften when she looked at me, it measured, calculated, as though deciding where she might fit, or perhaps what she might change. Still, she was polite, and my son's face lit up when she laughed. I welcomed her as best I could, offering tea, making the kinds of meals that had always drawn family closer together. She would eat delicately, pushing food around her plate as though my cooking were more novelty than nourishment. It didn't matter. I told myself these were just the edges of two different worlds learning to meet. When the wedding came, it was modest, by choice, my son said. I wore a pale blue dress I had sewn myself, with a brooch that had belonged to my mother. I stood for photographs beside them, smiling because I wanted him to remember me that way, not with worry in my eyes, but with quiet pride. After they married, the talk turned to living arrangements. My son came one evening, without her, and asked if they might stay with me for a while. They wanted to save for their own place, and he promised it wouldn't be long. I agreed before he had even finished speaking. The house had space, and truth be told, I welcomed the thought of company. Before they moved in, I cleared a wardrobe for her, shifted my sewing table to the back room so they could have more space. I even bought new towels, ones without the fraying edges I'd grown used to, thinking she might appreciate them. I wanted her to feel welcome. My son noticed, thanked me in his quiet way. She thanked me too, but with the air of someone accepting what was owed rather than offered. Still, I made space for her in more ways than one. I bit back small irritations when she rearranged the pantry, putting spices where I couldn't find them. I nodded politely when she suggested I try lighter recipes, less butter, fewer stews. I smiled when she offered to host her friends for dinner, even when it meant staying out of my own kitchen for the evening. I told myself these were small adjustments, part of sharing a home. In public, she was charming, attentive to my son, quick with a compliment for the neighbors, always ready to laugh at someone's story. In private, she was quieter, her words clipped, her tone flat. I sometimes wondered if my son noticed the difference, but if he did, he didn't mention it. Maybe he thought it wasn't important. Maybe he hoped it would pass. For my part, I let it pass. I remembered the early days of my own marriage, the way small misunderstandings could feel large until you learned how to live beside someone without treading on each other's shadows. I wanted to give her the chance to find her rhythm here. But rhythms, once broken, do not always return. Looking back, I can see the shape of it, the way she positioned herself slowly, quietly, like a piece on a board moving toward a winning square. At the time, I thought we were simply adjusting to life together. I didn't yet know that for her, the house was not a shared space, but a prize. And perhaps, in some small way, my son had begun to see it that way too. It began with small things, so small I almost convinced myself they didn't matter. A forgotten extra plate at dinner. A sigh when I entered the kitchen, as if my presence were a disruption rather than part of the home's rhythm. I told myself she was just tired, that we all have moments when we want quiet. But those moments began to multiply. One Sunday, my son invited friends over for lunch. I had roasted a chicken, the skin crisp and golden, the scent filling every corner of the house. When they arrived, she ushered them in with bright laughter, guiding them to the table where I had set everything out. "This is our home," she said, her arms sweeping the air as though to frame the walls. Her voice was light, but something in the phrasing caught me. Not the home, not my son's home, but our home, as though my place in it were already shifting in her mind. At another gathering, she introduced me to her friends not as Mama, or even my mother-in-law, but as our roommate. The word landed strange in my ears, too casual, too dismissive. Her friends laughed politely, perhaps thinking it a joke. I smiled faintly, hiding the small sting behind my teacup. My son didn't correct her. That silence spoke louder than the word itself. I began to notice other changes. The living room slowly lost its familiar anchors, the lace curtains I had stitched myself were replaced with stark white blinds, for a cleaner look. My husband's old armchair was moved to the back room without a word. I found my sewing basket tucked into a cupboard, its usual corner now occupied by one of her tall, glossy plants. These were not just rearrangements of furniture, they were rearrangements of history. Meals changed, too. She took over the kitchen more often, preparing dishes with flavors that were sharp and bright, served on modern plates that clinked too loudly against the cutlery. My stews, my bread, my slow-cooked roasts became rare, reserved for days when they were both out and I could reclaim the space for a while. I tried, in small ways, to hold on to the old warmth. I would bake on Saturday mornings, the smell filling the hall before they woke. Sometimes my son would wander in, drawn by habit, and slice into the loaf while it was still warm. But more often than not, she would appear soon after, eyeing the crumbs on the counter, wiping them away as though to erase the act entirely. In public, nothing seemed amiss. Neighbors still saw us together at the market, still heard my son speak kindly of me. She remained charming in front of others, her laughter easy, her tone sweet. But in the quiet of our shared walls, I began to feel as though I were walking through a space that no longer recognized me. The moment that settled deepest came on an afternoon when my son was late from work. I was in the kitchen, peeling carrots, when she came in. Without looking at me, she reached for the cupboard above my head and took down the plates I had used since our first year in this house, plain, sturdy, with small blue flowers painted around the rim. She set them on the counter, then paused. "These are so old," she said, more to herself than to me. "We really should get rid of them." I said nothing at first. My hands kept peeling, the rhythm steady, though I could feel my pulse in my throat. They've lasted, I said finally, my voice calm. That counts for something. She smiled faintly, but it was not a smile that agreed. Some things last, she replied, but that doesn't mean we have to keep them. It was not about the plates. I knew that. That night, as I washed the dishes alone, I realized how much the house had already shifted under my feet. The changes were not sudden or dramatic, they were quiet, deliberate, like water wearing down stone. She was not trying to make this house hers by living in it, she was trying to make it hers by erasing what had been here before. And my son either could not see it, or did not want to. Still, I told myself not to overreact. These were just small cracks in the surface, I thought. A house can withstand a few cracks. I didn't yet realize that, left alone, they would spread until the whole structure shifted. It was a Thursday evening in late autumn when she made the suggestion. The air outside carried that brittle chill that makes the windows hum in their frames. I had just finished clearing away the dinner plates, my son had stepped outside to take a phone call, and she lingered in the kitchen, leaning against the counter with a glass of wine in her hand. You know, she began, her tone casual, we've been talking about the future. Where we want to be in 5 years. I nodded, drying my hands on a tea towel. It's good to plan ahead. She swirled her wine slowly, watching the liquid catch the light. We think it would make things easier if the house were in both of your names. You and my husband. She said my husband instead of your son, as if reminding me where her allegiance lay. The words hung there between us, light on the surface but with something heavy beneath. I placed the towel on the counter, turning to face her fully. Easier in what way? Her smile was small, practiced. Well, you're not getting any younger. It's only sensible to think about what happens down the line. If the house is in his name, it saves a lot of paperwork. Keeps everything in the family. In the family. I thought of my husband's calloused hands stacking bricks, my own fingers raw from scrubbing mortar out of them at night. We were the family that built this place. Every nail, every painted wall was ours. I heard her words and understood she did not mean my family. My will is clear, I said, keeping my tone even. When the time comes, the house will be his. She tilted her head, as if speaking to someone who didn't quite grasp the logic. But why wait? If it's his now, you can avoid all the legal mess. We can even start making some changes to add value, maybe renovate the kitchen, update the bathroom. Her eyes flicked toward the worn wooden cupboards my husband had built by hand, as if they were nothing more than dated fixtures to be replaced. I'm not in a hurry to change the way things are, I replied. For a moment, her smile faltered, just enough to reveal the sharp edge beneath. It's not about hurrying. It's about doing what's practical. You wouldn't want to make things harder for us later. That us again. I met her gaze and held it. My husband and I didn't build this home to make things easier for anyone. We built it to last. She said nothing, just lifted her glass and took a slow sip. But I saw it, the flicker in her eyes, like a match struck in the dark. It wasn't anger exactly. It was calculation. Later that night, my son came to me. He didn't push the idea, not directly, but his words were gentle in a way that made them harder to brush off. She's just thinking ahead, Mama. Wants to make sure everything's smooth when, well, you know. I did know. I also knew he wouldn't have said it if he hadn't been persuaded, maybe by her reasoning, maybe by the soft pressure of her voice in his ear when I wasn't around. I didn't argue. I only told him that the house would remain as it was, that I had my reasons. He nodded, not in agreement but in acknowledgement, and that was the end of the conversation. Or so I wanted to believe. But from that evening onward, something shifted in her. The politeness remained in front of others, but in private her silences grew heavier, her smiles thinner. If before she had been rearranging the house to suit her taste, now it felt like she was positioning herself, a slow tightening of strings I hadn't realized she was pulling. I began to notice the timing of things. She would bring up new ideas for the house only when my son was present, as if planting seeds for him to water. She made subtle jokes about my old-fashioned ways, her voice light but her eyes steady, gauging his reaction. And though he never joined in, he never stopped her either. I told myself I had been through worse, that grief, hardship, and loss had not broken me, so this would not either. But there was a difference between facing storms that came from outside and weathering one that began under your own roof. That night, lying in bed, I could hear their voices through the thin wall between our rooms. Her tone was soft, coaxing, his, low and thoughtful. I couldn't make out the words, but I didn't need to. I already knew the shape of the conversation. They wanted the house. And she had made her first move. Not long after her offer, a new arrangement took shape, not spoken outright, but built in quiet, deliberate steps. She began taking over certain household expenses, the gas bill, part of the groceries, even the streaming service I rarely used. My son mentioned it one evening, his tone bright, as if to reassure me. "She just wants to help, Mama. We'll cover these things so you can relax a bit." Relax. As though I'd been straining under a weight I couldn't carry. I had managed this house alone for years without complaint. Still, I nodded, thanked them both. It seemed ungracious to refuse. With their new contributions came a subtle shift in the way she moved through the house. She started leaving her mark in every room, not just the kitchen or living room, but in the small spaces that had once been untouched by anyone but me. A new throw blanket draped over my husband's old chair. A glossy magazine on the coffee table, its pages spread open to photographs of bright, minimalist kitchens that looked nothing like ours. At first, there was still warmth between us. We shared meals, sometimes even cooked together. She made a seafood paella one Saturday night, fragrant with saffron, the colors vivid against the wide white dish. I complimented it sincerely, even though my tongue longed for the slow, rich comfort of beef stew. She smiled, pleased, and for a while I thought perhaps we could find a balance. My son seemed lighter in those weeks, he'd come home from work humming under his breath, sometimes stopping to chat in the kitchen before heading to their room. I took comfort in that, telling myself a little change in the house was worth the sight of his shoulders free from worry. But beneath that surface harmony, I could feel something tightening. She began inviting friends over more often, always people her age, lively and laughing, their voices spilling down the hallway long after I'd excused myself to bed. They were polite to me, of course, but I could see it in the way she spoke to them. She was the hostess, this was her space. My son hovered between us, his smile strained when I appeared in the doorway. Even the chores shifted. I'd come into the kitchen in the morning to find the dishes already washed, the counters cleared, as though erasing any trace of the night before. She started handling grocery lists without asking, bringing home brands I didn't recognize, crowding the pantry with jars and packets in sleek packaging. My favorite loose-leaf tea disappeared one week, replaced by a bitter black blend she claimed was stronger, better for you. One evening, I returned from a walk to find my sewing machine moved from the back room to a storage cupboard. When I asked about it, she smiled and said she was just trying to make the space more functional. She suggested I keep it packed away and only take it out when needed. I didn't answer her directly, just nodded, though inside I felt the faint echo of a door closing. I began adjusting my habits to keep the peace. I took my walks later in the day, staying out until after their dinner was done. I kept to my room with a book in the evenings, avoiding the bright chatter of her friends. I told myself it was easier this way, less friction, fewer reasons for her to push further. But every so often, there were moments that unsettled me. I caught her in the hallway one afternoon, pausing to study the framed photographs along the wall. Her eyes lingered on my wedding picture, her expression unreadable. When she noticed me watching, she smiled, but it was the kind of smile that left a chill in the air. The small changes kept coming. A vase I'd always kept on the dining table replaced with a low, modern centerpiece. My husband's tool set moved to the shed without mention. The old kitchen clock, its soft tick a steady companion for decades, taken down and replaced with a silent, digital one. Each shift was small enough to excuse, nothing worth a fight on its own. But together, they formed a quiet pattern. She was not asking for permission, she was claiming without words. I told myself she might simply be settling in, making the space feel like hers in the way newlyweds do. But deep down, I knew the difference between adding oneself to a home and trying to rewrite it entirely. Still, I didn't confront her. Not yet. I had learned long ago that some storms reveal more if you let them build. It happened on a Wednesday morning, the kind of morning where the light falls in soft stripes through the kitchen blinds and the house still smells faintly of last night's rain. I woke early, as I always did, and went to fetch the broom from the living room cupboard. But when I stepped inside, something felt wrong, not in the air, but in the space itself. The wall above the mantel was bare. For a moment, I thought perhaps the nail had come loose. My eyes went to the corner where my wedding photo had hung for nearly 40 years, the black and white portrait of my husband and me on the church steps, his arm around me, both of us young and sunlit, the day still warm in our faces. It had always been there, the quiet anchor of the room. Now it was gone. I looked around, scanning the shelves, the side table, the corner near the window, but it was nowhere in sight. I found it in the back cupboard, wedged between a stack of mismatched vases and an old bread bin I hadn't used in years. The frame was still intact, but the glass bore a faint smear, as though it had been wiped hastily with a cloth. When I asked about it later that morning, she didn't even pause in buttering her toast. "We're redecorating," she said lightly, as if it were a shared decision we'd made over coffee. "Thought it might be nice to freshen things up." I stood in the doorway, the photo in my hands. "Freshening up doesn't mean erasing," I said quietly. She laughed, not unkindly, but with that airy dismissal people use when they want you to think you're making too much of something. "It's just a picture," she said. "Don't be so sentimental. Just a picture." It was not anger I felt in that moment, but something colder, a tightening in my chest, a quiet recognition that this was not about the frame or the photograph. It was about the story it told, the years it held in its paper and glass. And she had decided those years didn't belong on the wall. I could have argued. I could have demanded it be returned to its place. But instead, I set it carefully on the sideboard in my room. Some things, once challenged, lose their safety in the open. That afternoon, I baked bread. The house filled with the smell of yeast and warmth, the crust turning a deep, even brown. My son came home while it was cooling on the rack. He smiled when he saw it, cutting himself a thick slice. "Just like old times, Mama," he said, crumbs catching in his beard. I wanted to tell him, about the photo, about the way she had spoken, but I stopped myself. He was relaxed, happy even, and I didn't want to be the one to shadow that. But later, I noticed the way he glanced at the mantel, then quickly away. He had seen the empty space. And he had said nothing. In the days that followed, I felt a quiet shift in my own behavior. I moved more carefully through the shared spaces, as though to avoid giving her reason to remove anything else. I kept certain things in my room now, my sewing kit, my mother's teacups, even the small brass clock from the hallway table. It wasn't fear, exactly. It was strategy. I was beginning to understand that some battles aren't won by open confrontation, but by protecting what you can until the time is right. Still, the absence on the mantel gnawed at me. Every time I passed through the living room, my eyes went to that blank wall. It was a wound that had been cleaned and dressed, but not healed. If someone quietly removed pieces of your life from your own home, would you speak up, or stay silent? The empty space above the mantel stayed bare for weeks. She never replaced my wedding photo with anything, as if the absence itself was the decoration she wanted. I learned to stop letting my gaze linger there. But once that first picture came down, the others followed. The photograph of my son at 8 years old, holding up the trout he'd caught with his father, gone. The framed cross-stitch I'd made of the house when it was first built, gone. In their places appeared glossy prints of seaside sunsets, their frames pale and uniform, the kind you could buy in any home goods store. When I asked where my things were, she said cheerfully, "Oh, I stored them for you. You'll have them safe in your room now." Safe. As though the walls of my own house were dangerous territory for my own belongings. It was never direct, never a slammed door or raised voice. Just a series of small, almost reasonable changes that, when taken together, began to feel like the slow tightening of a noose. She stopped knocking before entering my room. Sometimes she would step in with a question about the shopping list or a request for the broom, her eyes flicking over my space as though taking inventory. I began locking the door when I went out, something I had never done in all the years I'd lived here. The kitchen changed too. My favorite loose-leaf tea was gone, replaced by boxes of her preferred blend. She rearranged the pantry so the flour and sugar were on a higher shelf, out of my reach without a stool. "It's more organized this way," she said with a smile. My son seemed busier than ever, late shifts, weekend errands. When he was home, he was tired, answering my questions in short phrases before retreating to their room. We no longer sat at the table together after dinner, talking about the day. Even when we were in the same room, I felt the distance. I began taking longer walks, sometimes wandering through streets I hadn't visited in years. I'd pause outside shop windows, pretending to admire the displays just so I didn't have to go back too soon. When I returned, the house often smelled different, not of bread or stew, but of citrus cleaners or her perfume lingering in the hallway. One afternoon, I came home to find the curtains in the dining room gone, replaced by stark roller blinds. "Easier to keep clean," she said. I didn't tell her that the curtains had been a wedding gift from my mother, sewn by her own hands. I didn't want to give her the satisfaction of knowing what she'd taken. The garden, once my refuge, began to change as well. The clay pots my husband had made, each holding a plant we'd chosen together, disappeared from the porch. In their place were sleek, identical planters with decorative grasses that needed no tending. "Low maintenance," she explained. I thought of the years I'd spent coaxing herbs and flowers into bloom, the way my husband used to smile at the smell of rosemary on warm days. I told myself these were only things, that the heart of a home was more than its objects. But I could feel something shifting inside me, a slow retreat, as if I were pulling my own roots up bit by bit. It was not just the objects that disappeared, it was the conversations. She began speaking for me in front of others. If a neighbor asked how I was, she'd answer before I could open my mouth, "She's fine, keeping busy." If my son and I began a story about his childhood, she'd steer it toward something more recent, something that placed her in the center. The house grew quieter in ways that weren't peaceful. I found myself moving through it like a guest who had overstayed their welcome, careful not to take up too much space, careful not to leave traces behind. At night, I would sit in my room and run my fingers along the frame of my wedding photo, still tucked away on the sideboard. The glass felt cool and smooth, but beneath it, the paper held warmth, the memory of a day when the house was nothing but joy waiting to be lived in. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about what my son did not see, or chose not to. And in that silence, a different kind of distance began to grow, one that had nothing to do with walls. It happened on a day when the air in the house felt heavy, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. I had gone to the kitchen for a glass of water when I realized I'd left my knitting in the sitting room. Passing by the study door, I heard voices, low, quick, the kind of tones people use when they don't want to be overheard. I would have kept walking. I am not one to linger where I'm not invited. But then her voice cut through the muffled hum, clear and certain. "Once it's just ours, we can finally sell and get somewhere better." There was a pause, a shuffle of movement. Then my son's voice, quieter, almost a murmur. "You know it's not that simple." "It will be," she replied. "She's not going to live forever. And once she's gone, we'll have the money to do things properly. We could even be out of here by next summer if we start planning now." A chair scraped against the floor. I imagined him leaning back, rubbing his face the way he does when he's thinking. "I just don't want drama," he said. "Then don't make it dramatic," she answered, her tone smooth. "We'll handle it when the time comes. For now, just let me take care of things." I stood in the hallway, one hand against the wall, the plaster cool beneath my palm. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. The words weren't shouted, weren't cruel on the surface, but they carried the weight of a verdict already decided. I backed away quietly, my slippers soundless on the carpet, and went to my room. The knitting lay untouched on the armchair. I sat on the bed instead, staring at the wardrobe as though it could anchor me in place. They were planning for a life without me. Not in the distant, abstract way that children sometimes do, but in a tangible, practical way, with dates, with ideas of profit, with the assumption that my leaving was inevitable and my house was theirs to claim. It wasn't just her words. It was his silence. He hadn't told her no. He hadn't said, "This is my mother's home." He hadn't even said, "We'll see." He had let her lay out the map and had not taken it from her hands. That night, I made dinner as usual, roasted vegetables, a small chicken, bread warm from the oven. We ate together, the three of us, their conversation light and easy. I smiled when spoken to, nodded at the right moments, kept my hands steady even when my chest felt tight. After the meal, I washed the dishes alone. In the quiet clink of plates and the hiss of the tap, I heard their voices again, not the words this time, but the tone, the shared understanding I had not been part of. When I went to bed, I didn't cry. I thought of my husband, of the way we had built this house brick by brick, of the long nights we'd gone without certain comforts so that one day we could live without owing anyone. I thought of the title deed, folded neatly in a folder in the locked drawer of my desk. I thought of how easily they both seemed to speak of me as if I were already gone. And somewhere between those thoughts, something shifted. The grief was still there, yes, but it was no longer the heavy, helpless kind. It had edges now, sharp ones. They had drawn the first real line. I knew I would have to answer it. If you overheard your own family planning to take your home, how would you confront them, or would you wait? That night, the house felt different. The walls were the same, the furniture in its usual place, but something in the air had changed. It was as though the foundation itself had shifted, and I could feel the tilt in my bones. I woke before dawn, unable to stay in bed. In the kitchen, the world was still dark beyond the window, the street lamps casting faint halos on the wet pavement. I made tea, the kettle's whistle too loud in the silence, and sat at the table with my hands curled around the mug. The wood beneath my palms was smooth from decades of use. My husband had built this table, sanded it until it gleamed, sealed it with care so the grain stood out like ripples in water. I traced those lines as if they could steady me, but my mind kept circling back to their voices. Once it's just ours, we can sell, you know it's not that simple. I had lived long enough to understand that betrayal doesn't always arrive like a storm. Sometimes it comes softly, with measured voices and calm expressions, while the real violence is in the intent. The hurt was not in the idea that they wanted a different life, I could have accepted that. It was in the certainty that my presence here was temporary in their eyes, something to be endured until it could be cleared away. I thought of my son as a boy, running through this very kitchen, his hands sticky from jam, his laughter bright enough to fill the house. I had carried him through fevers, through heartbreaks, through the long years after his father died. I had saved so he could study, so he could have more choices than I did. And now, he sat in that study with his wife and planned for a future that began with me gone. I wanted to believe he didn't mean it, that he was just tired, worn down, and letting her words carry the conversation. But the truth was harder. He had not defended me. He had not defended the house. I stayed at the table until the first threads of light began to creep into the kitchen. I didn't cry. Instead, I let the quiet press in, the kind that forces you to face what's in front of you. In the days that followed, I moved differently. I kept my face calm, my voice steady, but I no longer filled the spaces between us with small talk. I let silence do the work. She seemed to notice. Her greetings were shorter, her smile more strained. My son didn't ask why. One afternoon, I found myself in the shed, sorting through boxes I hadn't opened in years. The smell of dust and wood shavings wrapped around me, familiar and grounding. In the bottom of one box, I found the old ledger where my husband and I had kept our building expenses, every brick, every nail, every tin of paint. His handwriting filled the pages, neat and careful, a record of the life we had made. I ran my fingers over the numbers, feeling the years between then and now close in like a narrowing path. I took the ledger inside and placed it on the table in my room, beside the folder with the title deed. For the first time in weeks, I felt something other than sadness. It was not yet anger. Anger burns hot and fast, and this was cooler, steadier. That evening, I stood in the kitchen while they ate in the dining room. Their voices carried through the wall, not the same conversation as before, but the same tone. Planning. Discussing. As if the house were already theirs to shape, to use, to trade. I understood, then, that my grief could not stay grief forever. If I left it there, it would sink me. I needed it to become something else, something I could use. But for now, I would keep my counsel. They believed I was still in the stage of silence, still absorbing the loss. Let them think so. It is easier to move pieces on the board when the other player believes you've stopped playing. In my younger years, I used to believe strength was a loud thing, a raised voice, a slammed door, a refusal delivered straight to someone's face. Age taught me otherwise. True strength, I learned, is often quiet. It is a decision made in a still room, with no witnesses but yourself. The morning after I found the ledger, I woke with a clarity I hadn't felt in months. The grief was still there, sitting in my chest like a weight, but it was no longer shapeless. It had edges now. And I could use those edges. I dressed carefully, the way I used to for Sunday markets, neat, unhurried, the clothes that made me feel capable. Over tea, I listened to their chatter about weekend plans, nodding as though nothing had changed. She was speaking about a trip they wanted to take to the coast, once we sort out some things here. My son agreed easily, neither of them noticing the way I was watching them now. After they left for work, I pulled the folder with the title deed from my desk and placed it in my handbag, along with the ledger and a small notebook. Then I walked into town, to the bank where I had been a customer for over 40 years. Mr. Hargreaves still worked there, older now, with more gray than hair, but his eyes were the same. He had known my husband, had watched us build this house from nothing. When I told him I wanted to make sure my ownership documents were up to date and properly secured, he didn't ask questions beyond the necessary ones. I saw in his face that he understood more than he said. From the bank, I went to see a solicitor, a woman I had met years earlier through a neighbor. She specialized in property law and, more importantly, she listened. I told her I wanted to ensure that no changes could be made to the ownership of my home without my explicit consent, regardless of circumstance. She explained my options, outlined the paperwork, and gave me a clear path forward. The rest of that week, I moved like water, quiet, steady, finding the gaps they didn't see. I transferred certain utility accounts back into my sole name. I set up automatic payments from my own funds so there could be no claim that I wasn't contributing to the household. I gathered every receipt, every bill, every scrap of paper that tied my name to this address, dating back decades. At home, I kept my manner unchanged. I still baked on Saturdays. I still asked my son about his day. I even complimented her new curtains in the dining room, though the fabric was cold and without character. Let them think I was making peace. Let them believe they were winning ground. But I began to speak less, to watch more. I noticed how she never left her phone unattended, how my son's laughter had a different timbre when it was only for her. I noticed the way she would glance at the walls as though mentally measuring them for change. It's a peculiar thing, preparing for a confrontation you haven't yet scheduled. Every act of normalcy becomes part of the disguise. You tend the garden not because you feel joy in it, but because it tells your opponent you are still thinking small. You bake bread not for the comfort of it, but because it makes them think you are rooted where you stand, immobile. One evening, as I folded laundry in the living room, my son came in and sat down. "You've been quiet lately," he said. I looked at him, really looked, and saw the boy he had been under the man he'd become. "I've been thinking," I replied. "About what?" he asked, his tone light but careful. "About the future," I said, and let the words hang there just long enough to see the flicker of unease in his eyes. Then I smiled, folded the last towel, and left the room. That night, I wrote in my notebook. Not feelings, plans. Dates, names, documents I needed to secure. Actions I could take without their knowledge. Steps toward a moment I hadn't yet decided on, but which I knew would come. I slept better than I had in weeks. The first step to winning a battle quietly is to make sure no one knows you've started fighting. I didn't announce anything. I didn't change my tone, my routines, or my seat at the kitchen table. Instead, I began weaving small threads of control back into the fabric of the house. The utility bills were the easiest. The electricity account, which had been switched into her name last spring under the guise of simplifying payments, was now back in mine. It took one polite call, a few security questions, and suddenly my signature was the only one on the file. The same with the gas. I didn't remove their access, I let the bills still arrive in the shared folder on the counter, but the power, in every sense of the word, had shifted back into my hands. The second step was the garden. She'd replaced my clay pots with sleek, pale planters months ago, but I still had the originals stored in the shed. One afternoon, while they were both at work, I brought them back out. Rosemary, thyme, and mint went into the soil, just as they had been before. I didn't say a word about it. If she asked, I would shrug and tell her they were easier for me to tend. She didn't ask. She simply let them be, perhaps thinking they were harmless. But every time I walked past those pots, I felt a small piece of the house return to me. I began looping in allies, not in a way that spread gossip, but with carefully placed truths. Mrs. Lockwood from across the street, who had been my friend for 30 years, stopped me one morning and asked if everything was all right. I told her, gently, that I was sorting out some property matters, and might need a witness for signatures in the coming weeks. Her eyes sharpened. "Of course," she said, and I knew she understood more than she let on. The solicitor worked quickly. By the end of the month, the legal protections were in place. No transfer, sale, or mortgage could be made on my home without my signed approval. It wasn't a change I needed to announce. It was enough that I knew that in any future conversation, the upper hand would be mine before a word was spoken. I also began reclaiming space inside the house. The wedding photo did not go back above the mantel, not yet, but I placed it on the sideboard in the living room, framed by fresh flowers from the garden. I didn't make a ceremony of it, didn't even look to see her reaction. Sometimes the most powerful move is to act as though you've done nothing unusual at all. She tried, once, to move the photo again. I found it leaning against the wall on the hallway table, and without comment, I returned it to the sideboard. This time, it stayed. The kitchen was trickier. She'd made it her territory, but I began cooking on the days she worked late, filling the air with the scent of stews and baking bread. My son would wander in, drawn by the smells, and sit at the table as he had years ago. We didn't speak of the past weeks, but I could see the memories flicker across his face. That was enough. And still, outwardly, I was the same, polite, agreeable, even warm when I needed to be. She had no reason to suspect that the ground beneath her was shifting. I understood now that this was not about a single moment of confrontation. It was about positioning, ensuring that when the decisive moment came, I would be standing on solid ground while she found herself exposed. The best part was how invisible it all was to them. They still spoke freely in the dining room, still made plans as though I were a piece of the furniture rather than the foundation of the house. I let them. Because the longer they underestimated me, the more room I had to move. If you could take back control from someone quietly undermining you, would you move fast, or wait until they thought they'd won? By the first week of spring, my plan was almost complete. The paperwork was secure, the utilities were in my name, the solicitor was ready to file a notice if needed. All that remained was the moment, the right setting in which the truth could be laid bare without warning, the kind of blow that left no room for denial or reversal. I didn't want an ugly scene. I had no appetite for shouting matches or slammed doors. What I wanted was clarity, for them to realize, in one clean moment, that the game they thought they were playing had ended before they even knew it began. The opportunity arrived in the form of their weekend trip. She'd mentioned it weeks earlier, an overnight visit to friends by the coast. I nodded as she told me, my face calm, my mind already moving through the sequence of what I'd do once the house was mine alone for a day. I had everything ready, the locksmith booked, the spare keys prepared, the letter from my solicitor neatly folded in an envelope. The plan was simple: make the changes while they were away, leave the truth waiting for them when they returned. The night before they left, something unexpected happened. My son lingered in the kitchen after she'd gone to bed. He leaned against the counter, sipping tea, and asked if I needed anything from the shop the next day. His tone was softer than it had been in months, almost the same as when he was younger. I nearly faltered. For a moment, I saw the boy who used to help me hang laundry on windy days, who once stayed up with me all night when I had the flu. The thought of locking him out of the house, even temporarily, pressed heavy against my chest. But then I remembered the words I'd overheard in the study. Once it's just ours. And I remembered his silence. The next morning, they left as planned. I watched from the front porch as their car disappeared down the road. Only when the sound of the engine faded did I go inside and close the door. The locksmith arrived on time, a quiet man with quick, efficient hands. Within an hour, every lock on the house was replaced. I paid in cash and thanked him. I had just finished placing the envelope with the solicitor's letter on the dining table when I realized something was missing: the original title deed. I'd moved it weeks earlier to a small safe in the shed for added security, but when I went to retrieve it, the safe was gone. For a moment, the air left my lungs. The shed was locked, but the marks on the doorframe told me it had been forced open. Panic is a dangerous thing, it can unravel even the most careful plans. But panic also sharpens memory. I recalled the last time I'd seen the deed, 2 days ago, when I'd checked on it briefly. Which meant it had been taken since then. I called the solicitor immediately. She reassured me that the physical document, while valuable, was not the only proof of ownership. The digital records and the protections we'd filed were intact. The deed itself could not be used to change ownership without my consent. Relief came slowly, but it came. The missing paper was a loss, but not a fatal one. Still, it told me something important: they had been moving pieces on the board too, even if they didn't yet know how outmatched they were. By evening, everything else was in place. The house was secure, the documents safe in multiple forms, the letter waiting like a quiet stone in the middle of the dining table. Now there was nothing left but to wait for their return. They came back just after sunset. I was in the kitchen, the smell of fresh bread still hanging in the air. Through the window, I saw their car slow into the drive, headlights briefly painting the garden in pale gold before snapping off. The sound of footsteps on the path. The rattle of keys, and then silence. A pause. A murmur between them. The soft, unmistakable clink of keys being tried again, and again. I waited. Finally, there was the sharp rap of knuckles on the door. Not frantic, but tight with contained frustration. My son's voice, "Mama? The key's not working." I walked to the door and opened it just enough to stand framed in the gap. Behind him, she was there, her coat still buttoned, her face set in a mask that pretended to be confused but couldn't quite hide the glint in her eyes. "You've changed the locks," she said, not as a question. "Yes," I replied. My voice was calm. "The locksmith came this morning." My son frowned, stepping forward slightly. "Why?" "Because," I said, "this is my home. And as of this week, every legal measure possible has been taken to ensure it stays that way." I handed him the envelope. He didn't take it immediately, so I placed it firmly in his hands. "That's from my solicitor. It explains the changes. No one can sell this house. No one can transfer it. Not without my written consent." She spoke before he could. "You can't just." "I can," I interrupted, my tone still even. "And I have." Her mouth opened, then closed again. My son looked at the letter, then back at me. "You should have talked to me first." I met his gaze steadily. "You had your chance to talk to me, the day you sat in that study and planned a future that began with me gone." He flinched. I saw it, the brief collapse in his expression before he turned slightly away. She recovered faster, straightening her shoulders. "Where are we supposed to go?" "It's late." "There's a hotel on the main road," I said. "Or you can stay with those friends you visited. Your things are in the garage, I've packed them for you." Her eyes narrowed. "You're throwing us out?" "No," I replied, and here my voice softened, not out of pity, but out of the deep, steady certainty that comes when you've already won. "I'm returning the house to what it was meant to be, a home built by two people who earned it. Not a stepping stone to somewhere better." They stood there for a long moment. My son looked at me again, but whatever words he thought of saying didn't make it past his lips. Finally, he stepped back. I closed the door slowly, not with a slam but with the quiet finality of a chapter ending. The latch clicked into place. For a moment, I leaned against the wood, letting the stillness settle. The house was silent except for the ticking of the clock in the hallway, the same one she'd once taken down and replaced, now back in its rightful place. I walked to the kitchen, poured myself a cup of tea, and sat at the table. The bread on the counter was still warm. I cut a slice, the crust crackling under the knife, and let the smell fill me. This was my house again. Not because the locks had changed, or the papers were secure, but because the air felt different, unclaimed, unmeasured, mine. If you had one moment to reclaim your dignity after months of disrespect, what would you say? The house breathed differently the next morning, a long, relieved exhale I could almost hear. Sunlight fell across the kitchen floor in pale rectangles, dust motes drifting like slow snow. I stood by the counter with my first cup of tea and listened to the clock's patient tick, the same steady metronome that had counted our years. The bread knife lay where I'd left it, a few crumbs on the board like small constellations. Everything was quiet, and the quiet was kind. They didn't call until noon. My phone buzzed across the table, skittering a little against the wood. I let it ring out. A message followed, my son's voice, weary, asking to talk. I listened once, then set the phone face down. Boundaries are sometimes nothing more than the choice to let a sound pass through you and not open the door. By mid-afternoon, I stepped into the garden. A thin breeze moved through the rosemary, releasing a scent that always takes me back to a summer when my husband grilled fish on a makeshift rack and laughed at the smoke curling his eyelashes. The clay pots were warm under my palms. For months, these were the only corners that hadn't been renamed, and it felt right to begin there, watering slowly, pinching brown leaves, setting the terracotta in neat lines like a small army returned from retreat. I heard a car door then, and the scrape of a suitcase on concrete. When I turned, they were at the gate. He carried a duffel. She had 2 rolling bags and a look on her face I had not seen before, not anger, not even surprise, something thinner, like a curtain drawn back to show the hard glass behind it. "We need to pick up a few things," my son said, voice low. "Just clothes. Work documents." I nodded. "The garage is unlocked." She pushed the gate with her hip and came toward me as though the air itself owed her passage. "We're not staying with friends," she said. "It's temporary. We'll figure something else out." I didn't answer. Words have weight, and I was no longer willing to spend mine on what did not concern me. Inside the garage, they worked in a hush broken only by the zip of bags and the dull thud of boxes shifting. My son paused once at the threshold and looked toward the kitchen window where the curtains, my curtains, were back in place. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. A small sound, like an apology that hadn't learned to stand. She emerged with a garment bag over her shoulder and stopped beside the herb pots as if they'd offended her. "This isn't fair," she said softly, a new tone, not the edge I'd come to know, but something with corners folded down. "We contributed. We made this place better." I rested the watering can on the step. "You made it different," I said. "Better is always a question of for whom." Her mouth tightened. For a heartbeat, I saw calculation gather itself again, old reflex reaching for a familiar lever. But there was nothing for it to pull. She looked past me at the window, at the clock, at the shape of the house returning to itself, and I watched the realization arrive, first as a flicker in the eyes, then as a small draining of color. She understood, finally, that there was no angle left. The papers were not suggestions. The door would not open back the way it had closed. My son came out then with a box labeled Winter in my hand, the letters I'd written years ago slanted and stubborn. He set it on the path and rubbed his brow. "Mama," he said, and the word tugged at something in me that had not stopped loving him even for a minute. "Can we talk?" I waited. I didn't. I shouldn't have. He glanced at her, then back to me. The sentence didn't know where to land. "We will talk," I said, "but not today." I kept my tone gentle, not because he deserved gentleness in that moment but because I did. "Right now you have somewhere to be." He nodded, almost grateful for the decision taken from him. They loaded the car. The trunk shut with a hollow sound that traveled through my ribs. At the gate, he turned. "Are you eating?" he asked, helplessly, like a man standing knee-deep in a river asking about the weather. I lifted the watering can. "Always." They drove away without drama. Tires over grit, a lift of dust, the small shiver of leaves returning to stillness. The house took that stillness in and held it. I spent the evening restoring small things. The old kitchen clock stayed, but I wound it with a careful thumb and forefinger. I brought the sewing machine out of the cupboard and returned it to the back room, the table fitting around it the way a hand remembers a glove. In the living room, I carried the wedding photo from the sideboard to the mantel and stood there a long time before I hung it. The nail slid into the familiar hole. When I stepped back, the room seemed to exhale again, as if a spine had been set right. Sleep came easily. Age changes the body's bargains, but not the mind's when it is at peace. I woke to birdsong and the faint mineral smell of morning, put on the kettle, and opened the front door to sweep the step. Mrs. Lockwood crossed from her garden with a covered plate. "You look well," she said, eyes brisk with understanding. "I am," I replied, and meant it. Midweek, an envelope arrived addressed in my son's handwriting. Inside was a short letter. Not an apology, not yet, but a softening. He said they had found a small place for a month, that he was working it out, that he wanted to understand. He asked if I could call when I felt ready. I set the letter on the table beside the ledger, both in my husband's and my son's hands, 2 lines of ink bridging years and intention. I didn't call that day. I baked instead. The dough rose like a patient breath. When I pulled the loaf from the oven, the crust sang its little song, the soft crackle I've always loved. I cut the heel piece, buttered it while it steamed, and stood at the sink eating with my fingers, salty and perfect. A woman can choose the order of her comforts. Days arranged themselves into new shapes. I cleaned cupboards at my own pace, kept what I wanted, boxed what no longer fit me. I opened windows wide. Laughed aloud once at nothing but light. In the afternoons, I walked to the greengrocer with a woven bag and brought home herbs that would root gladly in the old clay. I phoned the solicitor to thank her once more, not because anything new was needed but because gratitude has a way of closing a circle. And yet, I did not revise the past into something tidy. Grief, like a long seam, holds even when it stops showing. Some nights I sat with the ledger open and traced my husband's numbers the way I used to trace our boy's cheek as he slept. Love didn't cancel hurt, it simply refused to give it the final word. 2 weeks later, my son came alone. He stood on the porch with his hands empty and asked if he could come in. I let him, because doors are also choices. In the kitchen, he looked around as if trying to remember where to place his eyes. "It's the same," he said finally. "It is," I answered. "And it isn't." We talked. Not about blame, not at first. About tea, rain, work. Then he said, very quietly, "I should have said no." The words landed between us with the delicate weight of something true at last. "I would have heard you," I said. It was the only thing that needed saying. He nodded, eyes bright, and did not wipe them. He asked if he could help with anything. I handed him a bowl of pods to shell. We worked without hurry. The rhythm of the small pops was a forgiveness neither of us named. Later, standing at the door, he asked if she could write to me. "She understands now," he said, and I believed he believed it. Understanding can be honest and late at the same time. I told him she could send a letter, that paper gives people time to think before they speak. He smiled, the quick, crooked one from boyhood, and went down the steps lighter than he had come. When the house closed behind him, I returned to the mantel. The photograph caught the late sun, a thin gold along the glass. In the reflection, I saw my face beside my husband's younger one, 2 truths, present and remembered, sharing a frame. I touched the wood. The grain was smooth from years of hands learning, releasing, and holding again. The clock ticked on. The tea cooled. Outside, a sparrow tugged at a stem of mint until it came free, flew off with it like a ribbon. I laughed softly and let it go. Some things, once reclaimed, don't need guarding. They simply need living. Spring has always been my favorite season here. Not for the flowers, though they do arrive in gentle bursts, but for the way the air smells clean again, the way the light shifts in the late afternoon as though the house itself is being rinsed and hung to dry. It's been months since that evening at the door. The rhythms of the house have settled into something I recognize, not the exact life I had before, but one that belongs wholly to me. The days have a quiet shape, tea in the mornings, walks to the market, the hum of the sewing machine in the afternoons. Sometimes my son visits alone. Sometimes we speak on the phone. There is no pretending nothing happened, but there is a kind of gentleness between us now, like walking on grass that has just begun to grow back after frost. Her letter arrived last week. It was brief, carefully written, the words weighed before they were set down. She said she understood more now, that she had thought of the house as a prize rather than a home. She did not ask for forgiveness, only wished me peace. I wrote back with the same brevity, "We all learn in our own time." That was enough. The wedding photo is back above the mantel, where it belongs. Some days I catch the light striking the glass just right, and for a moment I see us as we were, young, certain, standing on the church steps with the whole life ahead. The site no longer feels like something I must protect. It feels like something that protects me. Yesterday, I planted more rosemary in the garden. As I pressed the roots into the soil, I thought of how stubborn the herb is, how it thrives in poor ground, how it holds its scent through every season. My husband once said a home should be like that, not perfect, not unchanging, but enduring. I stood, brushed the dirt from my hands, and looked at the house, at the bricks we laid, the roof we patched, the rooms that have seen everything. It is not just mine in paper and deed. It is mine in history, in work, in breath. And it will remain so.